Rock and roll music emerged in the 1950s as a combination of blues, rhythm and blues, jazz, country, gospel, folk, along with some other influences. It was a counterculture rebelling against the conservatism that existed in the U.S., and also against how they were told by society they should live. They wanted to live the life they wanted to live. This and the ideas of the beatnik movement would help form the base for what became a stronger rebellion in the 1960s. In this video, I will focus on 1960s rock and roll music up until the Summer of Love in 1967. There are several areas this can be broken down into, such as Motown records, surf rock, girl groups, dance crazes, folk rock, the British invasion, along with the San Francisco and Los Angeles sounds. Motown Records was founded by Berry Gordy Jr. early in 1959. Between 1960 and 69, the label achieved 79 records in the weekly American Billboard 100 Top 10 Songs. The label had a long list of musical sensations, including Diana Ross and the Supremes, The Temptations, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, Aretha Franklin, James Brown, The Four Tops, and Gladys Knight and the Pips. Michael Jackson and the Jackson 5 would sign with Motown in 1968. A teenage Diana Ross would approach her neighbor, Smokey Robinson, about getting an audition for her group. He got them this, and they signed with Motown in 1961. Surf rock emerged in the late 1950s with the Beach Boys, along with Jan and Dean, with numerous hits. There were other bands that had a hit or two. Surf rock competed with the girl bands of the early 1960s for the most hits. It would continue throughout the decade, but its influence would decline in the late 1960s. The early 60s girl groups included the Ronettes, the Shirelles, the Supremes, the Shangri-Las, Little Ava, the Chiffons, Martha and the Vandellas, and others. The very early 1960s saw a number of dance craze songs, such as The Twist by Chubby Checker, who also did The Pony. Others included Locomotion by Little Ava. The Mashed Potato was performed to a number of songs, and there was the Monster Mash by Bobby Pickett. There were others as well. Let's Dance by Chris Montez was a top seller citing these various dances. Folk music and folk music revival were practiced by at least a handful of musicians. Folk music is described as a storytelling way of music that has often been passed down from generation to generation throughout the world and throughout history. Bob Dylan was influenced greatly by this. His influences also included the beatnik writings, even tutored by beatnik writer Allen Ginsberg, classical literature, and the sounds of the late 1950s rock and roll. Joan Baez grew up in a very cultured family, with similar interest as Bob Dylan in a worldview of music and his presentation. Peter, Paul, and Mary were more or less the same. The folk music community was fairly tight. Bob Dylan and Joan Baez were very close professionally, as friends, and were romantically involved up until the mid-1960s. Peter, Paul, and Mary would often sing Bob Dylan's written songs. The folk music revival of the 1960s was a continuation of the beatnik ideas and rebellion, and a philosophy of being free from materialism, consumerism, and instead enjoying the experiences of life. The British had a reputation among European countries for an inability to sing and produce music, even to the point which jokes would often be made about this. Some called it a land without music. There was a growing passion in the 1950s that would change this. This passion was influenced by various American sounds. One was a music style called skittle, in which came from a sound derived from New Orleans jazz. Skittle used simple homemade instruments, or items such as jugs, which had another purpose. Another was the blues. The emerging British sound came from the industrial neighborhoods that related to the difficult African American life sang about in the blues genre. Rock and roll of the 1950s, particularly Elvis Presley, was another heavy influence. American counterculture writings of the bohemian movements, such as the Beatniks, fueled this rebellion. The early 1960s was not a time of great creativity in American music, and left American teenagers looking for something more. There was a void. Before October of 1963, British music had no influence on rock and roll. Then in that month, the first U.S. newspaper articles began to appear about the sensation of the Beatles in England. On December 10th, Walter Cronkite did a national TV story in the U.S. on the Beatles, which had been shelved weeks before. 15-year-old Marcia Albert, after hearing the story on the Beatles, wrote a letter to a local Maryland DJ asking him why we in America didn't have music like in England. On December 15th, the DJ had Marcia introduce the Beatles song, I Want to Hold Your Hand, live on the air. The reception was phenomenal, and the station was buried with phone calls about the new song in band. The local record stores were also stormed with requests for it. I Want to Hold Your Hand was shared with other radio stations at their request. On December 26, Capitol Records released the record in the U.S. The song reached number 1 on January 25, 1964. Several other British bands would shortly have big releases in the U.S., such as the Rolling Stones, the Moody Blues, Eric Burdon and the Animals, the Zombies, the Hollies, the Dave Clark Five, the Kinks, and Dusty Springfield. On April 17, 1964, British bands had 30 of the top 100 songs in the U.S. On May 8th, they had 8 of the top 10 songs. This was just 5 months after they had 0 songs in the top 100. The American music scene would embrace more British bands and singers. The Who, Small Faces, the Yardbirds, the Spencer Davis Group, Donovan, Herman's Hermits, Cream, then would all race up the charts. There was also the Searchers, Gary and the Pacemakers, Cilla Black, Petula Clark, and Tom Jones. The Beatles would have at least 2 of their songs hitting U.S. number 1 in each of their 7 years between 1964 and when they broke up in 1970. Many of the earliest big British bands had an edgy, deeper, and harsher sound than did the Beatles. The Beatles began their story in 1956 when John Lennon formed the group The Quarrymen. Paul McCartney joined in October of 1957. Paul recommended that a 14-year-old George Harrison join the band, but John was at first against this because of his age, but would give in. The name was changed to the Beatles in 1960. Ringo Starr would join them in 1962. From 1960 to 63, they would play in clubs in Liverpool, UK, and Hamburg, Germany. Their first big hit in the UK was Love Me Do, released in October of 1962. In January of 1963, they released Please Please Me, which became their first number 1 hit in the UK. Throughout that year, they would release other singles and become a sensation there. Skittle would be first adopted by British bands. Then the sound would merge with American blues and rock and roll. The Beatles began to create a unique sound with deeper lyrical meaning in December of 1965 with their album Rubber Soul, and later albums, thus making their transition from pop. Most of the other British bands that became big in the US were already in 1964 doing what the Beatles took until the end of 1965 to do. That is, they had created a non-pop-like sound and deeper lyrical meanings. The British bands would dominate from 1964 through 66, and when the psychedelic sound blossomed, American bands caught up. This whole new sound was the hippie sound. The British bands, however, would continue to strongly contribute to the hippie sounds throughout the 60s and into the 70s. The San Francisco sound were the bands out of the Haight-Ashbury district, a small area only several blocks long. These bands began playing for free, as that is what the hippie movement advocated. It included Janis Joplin and the Holding Company, Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead, Jimi Hendrix, the Steve Miller Band, Country Joe and the Fish, and Santana. This was entirely psychedelic music. A good portion of the Los Angeles music was related to what came out of the Haight and Ashbury district. It seems the influence for both of them was not only the Beatniks, but also Ken Kesey, his Merry Prankster group, and the parties he threw near San Francisco. These were from 1963 to 66. These parties were also taken out onto the road, driving up and down the West Coast, often with the Grateful Dead band playing. These Los Angeles groups would perform in clubs along the Sunset Strip, an area along Sunset Boulevard, in clubs like the Whiskey A Go-Go, the Troubadour, Ciro's, and Gazzarri's. Bands such as The Doors, Buffalo Springfield, The Byrds, Mamas and the Papas, and others came from this. There was a crackdown in this area by police requiring a curfew of 10 p.m. and against loitering. The area was a gathering spot for early hippies. The clubs had their youth permits removed. The youth permits allowed those who were under 21 inside. Riots broke out in protest to this. American actors such as Jack Nicholson and Peter Fonda joined in. The event, on November 12, 1966, was captured in one of the classic songs of the time, For What It's Worth by Buffalo Springfield. I have a link below to the song. Some sources reported that there were more than 3,000 protesters. Riots would happen on and off for several weeks. Most of the next several episodes, I will continue to look at music from the 1960s. The focus will be on the music that led to and promoted the hippie movement. The next one will be on the themes from the music in general. Then I will go into numerous songs of the era. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and see you in the next episode.